Go to the hotline. Connor O'Gara, Saturday Down South, joining us. Good morning, bud. How you been?
I'm doing well. I'm at the very tail end of a cold right now, and you can probably still hear it in my voice. So I apologize for that. But there was a moment last week where I had to start canceling radio shows that I committed to. And for those of us in this business, it's kind of underrated what it means when you realize you can't talk and how big of a hindrance that is in our ability to do our jobs.
Well, I got it. I forget if I've had you on the show. I'm sure I have. But how's fatherhood, man?
It's good. It's really, really good. You know, daughter's at daycare now for the majority of the day, which is just kind of weird. Like once you make that transition, you're like, oh, I'm not seeing my kid as much as I usually do. And then with Saturdays being so crazy in this job, it just kind of makes it seem like, oh man, like you just appreciate all the time you can get. But it's everything that everybody says it's going to be, including the daycare germs, which I definitely got like probably the second week that she was at daycare.
All right, let's talk about A&M, man, because I feel like I've watched two different teams this year. I saw a team for the first part of the year, and even in the wins, that couldn't get to the quarterback. And now they live with the quarterback. They're like with them step by step. What do you think of this transformation of the Aggie defense?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think the transition to becoming that group that realizes it needs to do that has been really important. And I think that if you saw the way that things played out against Miami and some of the things that they were trying to do defensively, you kind of realize that their corners were being put in some really tough spots and they weren't really equipped to handle that. And they have recognized we need to get that pressure. If we don't get that pressure, we're not necessarily good enough on the outside to be able to keep this thing afloat. And to their credit, they were able to do that. That Arkansas offensive line might be coached by Sam Pittman. It might be the worst in the SEC. It is that bad, which is just a wild thing to think about in year 4 in Fayetteville. So 15 tackles for loss, all credit to A&M, all credit. They had the clear advantage, and Arkansas fans have had it up to here with that offensive line. So that's probably the context that needs to be remembered when you look at that performance and the way that group played on Saturday.
All right, but then we looked at what they did against Auburn, and I don't think Auburn's any good either. But Auburn just went toe-to-toe with Georgia, who's supposed to have the best defense. So did Auburn figure things out, or did A&M's defense just got people figured out right now?
Yeah, I think Auburn is a much better team at home. I think they were very fired up for that. And that offensive line played much better in the game plan, the way that things were drawn up by Hugh Freeze. I think both things can be true at the same time. I think A&M has done better things up front to be able to get to the quarterback. And they are scheming in ways that clearly have some of these SEC offenses off balance. And that's the good news. And that's the thing that you can kind of hang your head on. But at the same time, if I'm projecting how I think this is going to look the rest of the way, I still think it's going to be a little bit Jekyll and Hyde with the defense. But the constant is the offense. And when was the last time that we said that? Probably 2020. I mean, even that, the constant was the offensive line and the way that group was structured around the Maroon Goons and the way that they could kind of have game flow work in their favor. Whereas this year's group, you can kind of give up some of those plays on defense, knowing that you actually have a chance to be able to claw back in these games because of how explosive your offense looks.
Well, I'm going to read you this stat. That's the 5th straight game with 400-plus yards, total yards, after only hitting the 400-yard mark 4 times all of last year. They've done it every game this year.
Here's the stat that I think is even more interesting. In the 5 games so far that Robert Patrick Petrino has been running this Texas A&M offense, they've hit 27 points each time. And I realize they had the benefit of a defensive touchdown this past week, but still, this team has hit 27 points each of the first 5 games. The last time that a Jimbo Fisher coached team had 5 consecutive games of 27 points in a season, 2014, Jameis Winston, Florida State. That's a pretty good sign. This thing is working. And I was banging that drum after Miami, was that if you're writing off this A&M offense, or you're thinking, oh, this was a failed experiment, you just haven't been paying attention. You've been wanting to stick to your narrative. This thing looks really good. And I think the fact that Connor Wigman going down and seeing Max Johnson perform the way that he has Obviously, credit goes to Max Johnson, a veteran who has had just the exact right attitude that you hoped he would have in this spot. But it's also a credit to Bobby Petrino, because I don't think that Max Johnson comes in and does the things that he's doing if he's still in the Jimbo Fisher offense that we had seen in the first 5 years in College Station.
All right, so this sets up a mega match here. SEC West, first place on the line, yada, yada, yada. Just your thoughts heading into it, because it feels like even though Bama took on a very bad Mississippi State team, they have figured out their offense, and they do have a strong defense.
They've figured out their offense. Their offense is still limited. It is. And A&M fans saw Jalen Milroe last year in that game in Tuscaloosa. There are still questions, in my opinion, about the ball security. In a very favorable matchup against Mississippi State, a Mississippi State pass defense that had just been wrecked against Power 5 competition, Tommy Rees had Jalen Milroe attempt 12 passes. That's it. They do not trust that passing game yet. So the question for me is, can A&M stop the thing that Alabama wants to do? They want to play joyless murder ball. That is their thing. I'd argue for the first few games of the season, it was more like just joyless ball, but they look like a team that has kind of figured some things out in the ground game. Jason McClellan is one of the most underrated players in the SEC. That Alabama running game looks like it could be a real strength for this group. But of course, I think it's the something's got to give matchup is, ironically enough, the Bama defense, which has played lights out since Texas, against this A&M offense. That to me is the great test that we're going to see play out in this game. And it feels like a better strength on strength matchup than any that we've seen in the last 2 years of these matchups.
How open is a national championship? And I'm not saying just for A&M, for anybody. It feels so weird this year in college football.
It's wide open. Who hasn't had a game wherein they've showed significant flaws? You can go up and down and find holes to poke in every single team. And that includes the team that's trying to become the first team to three-peat since 1936 Minnesota. You look at Georgia, and these first 2 games against Power 5 competition, they faced double-digit deficits in the first half. The previous 30 games during this 2-year run that they've had of winning titles, that's as many times as they've been trailing by double digits in the first half. So you look at it, a team like Florida State, and you're like, all right, well, Florida State does so many things well. They've got the quality wins. Defensively, I think they still have a lot of issues. Everybody in the SEC has clear weaknesses at this stage of the game, clear weaknesses that can get you beat week in, week out. It's not just like, you know what? We have like a corner who's not really ready for this big time environment. No, like real legitimate weaknesses. It could make for a crazy year. It could make for a crazy weekend. If A&M beats Bama, that is the ultimate. This thing is wide open, and I have no idea which way it's going to go in the West.
All right. So what if Missouri beats LSU? What's the talking point after that?
It's a great point, because this matchup is terrible for LSU. I mean, it's so bad. LSU secondary is just getting ripped to shreds. And look, I get a lot of things wrong. I do. And in a prediction business, of course, I'm getting a lot of things wrong. One of the things I said in the preseason was that I thought LSU was going to lose the 2 bookend games that it had in the month of September. And that was against Florida State, against Ole Miss. And what we've seen play out for LSU, because of this secondary, is they have just gotten wrecked against quarterbacks that can move the pocket and stretch the field. And you know what? Against this Mizzou offense that suddenly has a high potent passing attack led by Brady Cook, the guy who just set the SEC record for most consecutive passes without an interception. And oh, by the way, you're throwing to a former 5-star guy in Luther Burden, who currently leads the country in receiving. This Mizzou passing attack can absolutely light it up against LSU. If LSU loses this game, I think there are a lot of people going, I don't know anything. If Mizzou is going to be 6-0 and beating LSU, and LSU is this 3-loss team, we're not going to know what the difference is between good and bad in the SEC. And it's going to feel like this is just such a week-to-week league that is so hard to predict. Will
Brian Kelly get the Jimbo treatment? Because the 2021 year was right after 2020. And we started hearing about Jimbo mid-season. Even after the Bama game, there was conversations about it. Does BK get that same kind of talk?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Even more than Jimbo.
Really?
Brian Kelly, well, here's what I mean. Here's what I mean. I shouldn't say that he's going to hear the buyout talk as much as Jimbo does, but even more than Jimbo, when Brian Kelly loses a game, the internet tees off. I mean, it is unbelievable. And I got a reminder of that in the opener against Florida State, wherein they lost to a really good Florida State team, but people love to hate Brian Kelly. They love to hate Brian Kelly because of all the things that he's been about at Notre Dame, the way that he kind of talks about his players sometimes. It just kind of rubs people the wrong way. And I think that will absolutely be part of the conversation. It's the most talented team he's ever had. And for my money, they're already out of the playoff discussion because of what they did in non-conference play and the fact that they have such a glaring weakness on the back end. And there will be a lot of people that criticize him moving forward, even if they aren't necessarily, to lose this game this weekend against Mizzou. That's just the way that people are on the internet with BK.
Connor, I don't know what to think of Ole Miss because the way they looked against Bama made me think, look, and it's Bama, I get it, but again, not the Bama teams that we're used to. Made me think, I don't know how good they are, but dude, this team can throw. They can light it up. Can they do it against some of the better defenses, I guess is the question.
Look, my projection for Ole Miss coming into this year was that the spectrum was going to be all over the place. I had them beating LSU, and I had them losing at home to Vandy. So that lets you know what I think of this Ole Miss team. They are a pendulum that swings far and wide. And I think so far, I think they've kind of looked like what I thought they would be. Now, defensively with Pete Golding as their DC, they do play a little bit more bend don't break. That was a really rough showing, obviously, against a very high-powered LSU attack. But the Jackson Dart splits of numbers against FBS teams with a winning record versus FBS teams without a winning record, they were night and day coming into this season. And that LSU game is going to kind of change things. But after Bama, I was saying, well, this is why I don't really trust him that much, because he gets better competition, and those decisions that he makes, man, you're just like, dude, you don't have to throw it into traffic. You don't have to try and run over 2 or 3 defenders. You're not really built to be able to do that. So I do have some skepticism about Ole Miss going forward. It's still a program that's trying to make the SEC championship for the very first time. And obviously they already have that Bama loss, so that hurts them. So I think I have more questions than answers about that Ole Miss passing attack, because I do think Dart has shown some nice things in year 2 in Lane Kiffin's system, but still, historically speaking, it just hasn't been necessarily where you'd want it to be against that quality competition.
Connor O'Gara with us here Saturday Down South. Connor, I've been waiting for that Ray Davis type performance from Kentucky. I was waiting for that from Kentucky. The offensive line really, to me, was the story. I know Ray Davis gets the headlines, but they actually came together, and that was their big problem last year.
Yeah, they really did. The Big Blue Wall was scrutinized heavily last year, and as it should have been. And that was the biggest question with this team coming into this year was, are they actually going to be improved? They couldn't be any worse than last year. They were a train wreck last year, and it didn't help that Will Levis was a guy that liked to hold on to the football. It was just a bad combination. The Rich Gangarello experiment did not work. My doppelganger, Liam Cohen, has made them look a lot better this year at times. The Ray Davis game needed to happen because, look, that passing game is still just not in sync. It has not been what I thought it was going to be. I thought Devin Leary was going to be one of the 3 best quarterbacks in the SEC this year. And so far, it has just looked totally out of sorts. Berrien Brown had that bad drop in the end zone against Florida. Dane Key has been just so hit or miss so far in this young season. And they have really needed to lean on that group. And Ray Davis, who came over from Vandy, and somehow, after a 1,000-yard season, that guy did not get preseason All-SEC love, which I thought was an absolute joke, has looked the part. I mean, more rushing yards than any FBS player in a game this year. He did that against a pretty good Florida run defense, too. That was 15th in the country coming into this one. So, yeah, I think Ray Davis is just a phenomenal player. If you know his story growing up homeless in San Francisco, the things that guy's been through, man, I just tip my cap to him. He is the heart and soul of that team right now.
Connor, A&M's next 3 games are against Alabama, obviously. That's the big one this weekend. Then to Tennessee. Then bye week, followed by the South Carolina game. Those 2 teams played each other. I still don't know if I know Tennessee. I still don't know if I know South Carolina. What's your take on both of those?
I think I know South Carolina. I think I know Tennessee too. I think the Tennessee game is, I was looking at in the preseason. I think that's a bad matchup for A&M. I think that's a bad matchup with how well they play typically at home and what they do well. They run the football really well. Now, Joe Milton is a little bit more of a liability. They lost Brew McCoy to what looked like a really serious injury over the weekend. You just feel terrible for the kid that's worked his tail off. But that Tennessee matchup is going to be really difficult because of how they fire off the football at Neyland. And I think that could be kind of daunting for what A&M would like to be able to do defensively. But South Carolina, man, South Carolina is a one-trick pony. It's Spencer Rattler, Xavier Legette. And outside of that, you really can't rely on a whole lot. That's kind of who they are at this stage. They're not going to beat you in the trenches with what that identity is right now. And they are such a liability on that offensive line that it doesn't really give you a whole lot of confidence in them. But Rattler, I mean, up until that Tennessee game, was playing the best ball of his career. Xavier Legette was leading the country in receiving coming into last weekend. He is absolutely explosive and can torch that A&M secondary if they're not able to cover him and if it's shades of what we saw against Miami.
Penn State, man, they're the one of the teams before the season started I had as a college football playoff team. They're living up to that so far. But what do you see happening the rest of the way? Because they're good offensively and they're very good defensively.
Yeah, look, defensively, they're lights out. They are. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State are on the top 3 in the country in scoring defense at this stage. But for me is always James Franklin. What is James Franklin going to do in the final minutes of a big-time game against quality competition to ruin his team's chances of winning? Like, that's just what it feels like it always comes down to. Everybody always says, like, they play Ohio State really well. They play Ohio State really well. They beat Ohio State once since James Franklin's been there, and they beat him because of a blocked field goal on a ball that bounced their way during a year in which they obviously went on to win the Big Ten championship. That's always, to me, the big hang up that I have about Penn State. I just always can't get there with that team, although they've looked really solid. Obviously, Drew Aller, the 5-star kid that they were so hopeful was going to be that guy, he can be enough for them with how good they run the football. But yeah, James Franklin to me is just always that guy that I'm just waiting on him to do something stupid.
How about this Texas OU game? I look at Texas, man, and I don't find them to be that good, and maybe it's because I'm an Aggie. But they're that good in this college football, right? No, I'm just saying, like, I saw how vulnerable they were against Rice, vulnerable against Wyoming. But in these big games, Quinn Ewers has shown up.
I think the thing that we should be looking at this year with some of these big time teams, and I'll include Oklahoma in that conversation, a team that's top 4 in the country in both scoring offense and scoring defense, who has quietly just slid under the radar with how good they've been to start off this year, averaging 47 points a game, allowing like 10. I mean, that formula will work. That's pretty good. Competition obviously gets better this weekend. But I think the thing that we need to look at in what this first month of college football has told us with teams like Texas, teams like Florida State, Ohio State, is that in Georgia as well, what's your upside? You're going to have bad moments this year, but what's your upside? What do you look like when you're at your absolute best? Texas was at its absolute best against Bama. Their best is still probably better than 99% of the country. I believe that to be true. Now, can they have a down game? Will they probably lose at least one before the Big 12 championship? Yeah, I think so. I think that's a fair thing to point out with how kind of hit or miss Quinn Ewers has been really post Alabama and kind of some of those scoring droughts that they've had. But they won convincingly against a Kansas team that a lot of people are saying, hey, it'd be very Texas-like to lose a game like this at home. And all of a sudden everybody's saying, oh, see, same old Texas. And I think defensively on that front is nasty and they are going to get after you. And that's kind of their constant. What's going to be the thing that keeps them in games. And it's going to make them a really, really difficult team to beat for 60 minutes.
All right, last thing for you. What's your gut on this Bama A&M game? Not necessarily picking it, but just how do you think it could play out?
Down to the wire. I think down to the wire, man.
Again.
I again. And the thing that I kept coming back to and why I said last week when Max Johnson was going to be QB1 moving forward with the Connor Wigman injury was that I said Max Johnson is the most important player in the SEC West race. And what I meant by that is you look at what A&M has done against Bama these last 2 years and what A&M has done against LSU these last 2 years as well, and how tough they have played both of those teams despite the obvious issues that A&M has had. And this year with an A&M team that I have more confidence in, I really do, and a Bama team that I suddenly have more questions about than ever. Look, I saw that game play out. If it's a proper goal line call, I think A&M wins that football game in Tuscaloosa, and it's an all kinds of historic loss for Nick Saban. Obviously, they didn't have Bryce Young, but same starting quarterback. And look, I think Jalen Milroe has made some strides. Has he made a ton? Has he made enough to make you feel like he's really going to beat quality competition on the road and be able to string together big time conversions with his arm? That I don't know. And I think this is a good down to the wire game. And I think it's a great test for that Bama defense with how much A&M looks improved in terms of getting those explosive plays in the passing game.
Connor, I appreciate you, man. Thanks so much for doing it.
Anytime. Appreciate it.